Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name's Caitlin. I'm the Community Learning and Engagement Manager at the Victorian National Parks Association, and I'll be the host this evening for this webinar. I'm joining you this evening from Dja Dja Wurrung country, and Wombat Forest, a really special place to me, is just around the corner. It's been a special place to me, the Wombat Forest, for a long time. As a child, I spent time in the Wombat on family adventures. As a parent, I've spent many years and countless hours with my children in the Wombat Forest and with friends on family adventures and at bush kinder sessions. And as a professional, I've spent hours upon hours recording wildlife in the Wombat Forest with community members as well. For over a decade, I've been involved in monitoring of wildlife in the Wombat Forest. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. The webinar is an overview of the opportunities for new and better national parks in Victoria and why now is a particularly important moment. The Victorian National Parks Association acknowledges the many First Peoples of the area now known as Victoria, and we honour their continuing connection to and caring for country. We support traditional owner joint management of parks and public land for conservation and natural heritage. The Victorian National Parks Association is a registered charity, and we rely on donations to carry out our important work for protecting nature for future generations. And some of the donors who support us are with us this evening, and thank you. We're really grateful for your generous support, and we're pleased to give you an overview of what you are helping us to achieve. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to our Executive Director, Matt Ruckel, for our feature presentation. I've worked with Matt for about 17 years now, and over this time, I've really observed that one of the things that this community, nature conservation community in Victoria really values about Matt is his very deep knowledge of the conservation movement in Victoria, both historically and today, and how all the pieces of that movement really fit together. And Matt's going to be sharing some of this knowledge with us tonight. We'll be able to hear a fair bit about his knowledge and experience in the conservation movement. Matt's going to be speaking a lot about the background processes, the science, the technical reasoning for why decisions on nature conservation are so pivotal right now. And this science and this background is critical. But something that we also really want to be aware of when we're talking about all this technical reasoning, etc., is that also the work that we all do really comes from the heart. This love for nature is why we volunteer, it's why we donate, it's why we do our work, it's why we build our community, write submissions, research, restore nature, share nature. And I'm talking about all of us here in this webinar tonight. We all have that great deep love for forests, grasslands, marine life, nature across the state. And that is why we're all here coming together as a community this evening. And as someone who stands up for nature yourself, I hope you're also taking some time to enjoy nature too. Just a couple of items of housekeeping before I hand over to Matt. So the session with Matt's going to be about 45 minutes. There'll be time at the end for about 3 or 4 questions. And you'll be able to put those questions to us and to Matt using the Q&A function. The chat function's not active this evening because we have potentially a couple of hundred people joining us. So, but the Q&A function is available for you to use to submit your questions, and we would love to have some questions from you. We should be wrapped up by about 7 o'clock or so. So with all of that in mind, I'd like to hand over to Matt.
Well, great not to be here with everybody tonight. I'm just playing with my presentations because I've discovered if I don't move it, it freezes. So apologies in advance if that happens somewhere through the presentation. So I'm on Wurundjeri country, so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners as well, and their elders, past, present, and emerging. So one of my favourite parks, I grew up in the Mallee, so Hattah Kulkyne is one of my really special spots. But we've got some great parks all the way across Victoria. Now, this map is a little bit hard to read, but it's really a distribution or a model of the habitats that existed pre-European settlement in Victoria. And one of the things that we face in Victoria is really the extent of clearing that's gone on. So this is a map of what's left, and we've really got this sort of 2 or 3 track landscape with up to sort of 80% of private land cleared across the state. That's all the white bits, the green and oranges and yellows are relatively intact areas that remain, but these are also under stress because they've been subject to a whole raft of extraction industries up until recently, logging, but also grazing and support of things like gold rushes, which had a dramatic impact on central Victoria in the last in the early days. So looking at the state now, we've got sort of a cleared private land landscape. Having said that, there are still very important patches of bush on private land, but they tend to be in smaller areas. The really big blocks tend to be public land, and you can see this map here, which is representing the state forests, national parks and other types of conservation reserves on public land. And I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of purposes of national parks and the history of some of those in Victoria. So the current legislation, when BNPA was established in 1952, there wasn't really any legislation to protect parks, but one of our first campaigns was to establish a National Parks Authority in the first legislation. That was then updated in 1975. And essentially, the objectives are about preservation and protection of the natural condition for use and enjoyment and education of the public. So these are the objects of the National Parks Act. They're about protection of Indigenous flora and fauna. It creates obligations around controlling exotic fauna and flora, and importantly, highlighting important areas of scientific interest. And also the need to create a management plan, particularly for state and national parks. There are different types of parks, and they tend to have different objectives, level of protection, management, in some cases, different bits of legislation. In public sort of mind and in common parlance, we often talk about national parks because we talk about the National Parks Act, but there's under the National Parks Act, there's national parks, there's state parks, marine national parks, some coastal parks, some regional parks, and also wilderness areas and remote natural areas, which are a bit of a sort of a zoning layer that sits on top of areas determined as a national park. So these are about, and it's important just to have a sense of that these have got different sort of purposes and objectives for what you want to manage the land for. So talking a little bit about those, we also have what we call the Conservation Estate. So a key part of this is the Crown Land Reserves Act, and this includes nature conservation reserves, flora and fauna, wildlife reserves, flora reserves, nature conservation reserves as well. There's a whole suite of smaller bits, bushland reserves, wildlife reserves that allow hunting, and probably, a dozen or so different types of tenures for different areas of the conservation estate. This is all up for grabs at the minute. There's a bit of a review going on, and that'll probably emerge in the next year or so, where they're talking about rejigging some of these. So things like scenic reserves and bushland reserves, streamside reserves, which are generally small areas. They all have conservation objectives of certain terms, but they're talking about changing the Crown Land Reserves Act to have a Public Land Act and shifting some into the National Parks Act. and having further standalone legislation. There's also things like metropolitan parks, which are places like Albert Park. All these things are managed by Parks Victoria, who also have their own legislation. So talking a little bit about the history of parks. So I touched on, so in 1952, really, these are roughly to scale. Waterfeld's probably a little bit bigger than it needs to be, but roughly, had Wilson's Prom, some parts of Waterfeld, some areas around Fern Tree Gully. And these, while places like the Prom were called national parks, they were really managed by committees of management. And particularly post the Second War, Crosby Morris and the other founders of BNPA were very worried about the condition. They were also worried about, in some of the places, that these areas were being logged, grazed, having other extractive industries to raise money to manage them, so creating perverse outcomes. In the following years, through sort of 1950s to 72, there was a major battle around the Little Desert, which is the green area up just west of Horsham, which created a bit of a watershed in Victoria's history and led both to the establishment of the park, but also the creation of the Land Conservation Council, which is VACS, is the predecessor of in today's duties. And the role of the Land Conservation Council was to assess areas for their best use, including for greater protection. As you can see through the 1950s to 72, some areas were starting to be added, and you saw a fairly significant increase in areas identified through LCC processes in the 20 years between 1972 and 92. Places like the Grampians, the Big Desert, Sunset Country, and the Alpine National Park, all of which took over a decades in some instances, particularly for the Alps, to create through an exhaustive consultation process, and then finally legislation. So between the 90s and 2012, we also had this sort of important expansion, the Yarra Ranges particularly, and a big turning point around the Otways, 2002, and then Red Gum and Box Island Park, which were key players up in the north of the state. And probably the last of those was Kabobony and the Red Gum Parks, which are probably our most recent large additions to the national park estate. So going back to, we also had the important and long-running battle to create marine national parks and sanctuaries, which happened in 2002, which is about 5% of state waters. And that's just the little blue dots along the coast there. Marine National Victoria was the first jurisdiction to have an extensive network of marine national parks. Sanctuaries tend to be much smaller, important areas, but Victoria was a real world leader at that. Unfortunately, we haven't had any further additions to the marine parks since then. So if we go back to thinking about the state, why do we have parks in particular places? We've had these extensive consultation processes with the Land Conservation Council, and more recently the Victorian Environmental Assessment Council. This is a map, it's a model generated by computers. The redder it is, the higher the natural values. So it's really layers of records of threatened species and other values to create a bit of a model. And you can see there are very high important bits. If you stick the park system over the top, you can see that many of our national parks do protect very important areas of natural value. If we flick backwards and forwards a little bit, you can see that, but you can also see that there's some key gaps. And these are these redder bits outside of the National Parks estate. So Central Highlands, East Gippsland, to the west of Melbourne, which is really driven by the scarcity of grasslands, central Victoria around Wombat Forest, and there's this important public land pieces out in the southwest of Victoria as well, between the Little Desert and Portland. And that really gives you a sense of where the significant gaps, and there's numbers of different ways that you try and cut that. You can do it with this sort of map, but you can also do it with things that they call like the comprehensive adequate reserve system, where you try to identify representative patches of vegetation to get a network of parks which protect each different habitat across the state. So there's about 300 different vegetation types, and so the aim is to get a proportion of those in protected areas in the long term. So that's the representativeness. You need enough of that to make it survive, and it needs to be adequate as well, is the traditional way of looking at it. But of course, there's also practical things, and so you need to think about management, but also about visitation and all of those types of things. Now, Victoria hasn't, in the last decade or so, created a lot of new parks, but there's a real push now at both a global level and to a lesser extent a national level to improve the protection of our land and sea. So globally, there's been a Convention of Biological Diversity, and one of these parts is about protecting 30% of land and water by 2030. Australia has signed on to that. Both Scott Morrison and the current Labor government have endorsed it. So it's the COMIN, Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, if you like that sort of thing. About 190 countries have signed it. So while that's a federal government thing, because they're in charge of international affairs, all environment ministers and jurisdictions have signed on to that, including Victoria in 2022, to work with the federal government to protect 30% of Australia's land mass and 30% of marine areas by 2030. So currently in Victoria, we have approximately 18% of the terrestrial land mass and about 5% of the marine in protected or conservation areas in its sort of looser form. Australia's got large areas as well, so there is a bit of an incentive to do more, but you want to make sure it's done in the right places. The other opportunity that has arisen is the end of native forest logging. So the government was fairly firm in the end of and brought forward the end of native forest logging. Originally, they'd proposed to end it by 2030, but that was brought forward to in April last year to January the 1st, 2024. This was a process of partly a loss-making exercise by Vic Forests and some extensive litigation processes which had highlighted that it had been behaving illegally, as well as the impact of severe bushfires. There are no options for regulatory reform, and it just simply continue is the government statement. So the east of the state that was put in place, which is these blue areas out in the eastern state, which is what they call the allocation order, and was the large, extensive commercial logging area. But they'd forgotten about these red areas in the west of the state, which were done through licences under the Forest Act, forest produce licences, but they have since been aligned with the government's phase out and ended in February 2024 as well. So native forest logging has ended, and part of that package, so there's still issues with loopholes and things, which we've talked about in other webinars, things like private land logging and so on, but tonight we're talking about the potential for new parks. And so one of the commitments as part of the package to end native forest logging was that the government was establishing an advisory panel to make recommendations to government on the areas of forests that qualify for protection of national parks, as well as other recreational activities. And this was confirmed a couple of times by the next Environment Minister. And there's essentially two processes that have been put in place. One was a thing called the Eminent Persons Panel for Community Engagement, and it's been looking at the east of the state, around the Great Forest National Park, and then there's this panel process which has been established to look at the east of the state, which is just flipped back a bit, the blue area over there. So the panel has been announced. It includes the previous Environment Minister, Lisa Neville, a number of other people from the Eminent Persons Panel, the head of VAG. They haven't necessarily commenced work yet, but the Eminent Persons Panel for Community Engagement in the Central Highlands around the Yarra Ranges has and have released at least an interim report looking at those areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So there's a heap of gaps, I suppose, is our sense in the Victorian Reserve System. Some of these priorities, and I won't talk about them all tonight, but we're keen to see the delivery of the Central West Parks, Great Forest National Park, as well as additions to some of the other key areas which could look a bit like that, including grasslands. If we wanted it all, it'd be really fantastic to have a roadmap to ensure that we've got a completely comprehensive system which picks up both marine but also our terrestrial gaps and some of those very underrepresented ecologies and habitats like grasslands. So part of the opportunity is not just those global commitments and the government's commitment to look at creating new national parks over this period while they're working out what to do post-logging, but there is also a very high level of support amongst Victorians, with about 86%, and this is consistent over the last few years. Every time we ask the question, there's a pretty high level of support. It may drop a bit or change a bit depending on which area you talk about, but largely in the high 70s to high 80% support. So just giving a bit of an update of where we're at on a couple of areas, including Central West. So we've been working on this for over a decade now, and this is the area around the Wombat Forest, Mount Cole, Cobors, Welsford Forest up near Bendigo. They're forests which have over 370 threatened plants and animals. They've been identified as one of the areas where there are clear gaps in the representative nature of the park system, and there's been a fairly torturous process, which is not inconsistent with what happens with many, but this one has been slower than others. So there's been talk of better protection in these areas since the 1990s, big campaigns to end clearfell logging, a commitment to do an assessment by the Bracks government in 2002. We initiated a community assessment with local groups in 2010. And then we've had a formal independent VAC process since 2017, which took some years and was delayed a couple of times. There was a state election, it was delayed again. Finally, the report was tabled in 2019. And the legislation says you're supposed to respond in 6 months, but it did take 18 months before there was a response from the government. So it was 18 months late. So the government has agreed to legislate these parks. Part of the package was that they'll be logged first, up to 2030 in some places like Mount Cole. But since the end of native forest logging has happened, there's no excuse that we shall not proceed. And we're a bit perplexed by the government's response on parks, considering the global sort of push for them. We're at the point of needing the legislation to be produced and tabled and passed through both houses of Parliament. According to the government, there's been some hold-ups with surveys of the park boundaries, which you need to do for the legislation, but we're still perplexed by that. and it's taken more than 3 times longer than any other park in the last 20 years or so. So you can see Fox Island Park, it was 9 months from government deciding they were going to do it to doing it, 15 months for Red Gum, 12 months for the Otways, and we're 35 months in and still waiting. Quite a few of our members and supporters, and some of you have written to the Premier, might have got a letter saying they're going to legislate the Wombat National Park, Wombat Lerderderg National Park, and Mount Cole this year, which is a positive step, but that's only a relatively small proportion of the whole package that was agreed to. So we're keen to see that happen, but we still need to get on with it to get it done. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another area, which is slightly different to the sort of traditional public land campaigns, but it's been some really important work in the last few years, and it'll be an ongoing piece of work, which is the Western Port Woodlands. And this is an interesting one because it's a series of nature conservation reserves down behind Grantville, really. So you've got Adams Creek, the Gerties, Grantville Nature Conservation Reserve, but you've got a major piece in the middle. And these are really sort of fragmented places, but there's still a sort of wildlife corridor in place in one of the most cleared bioregions or areas in the state. And there's a real missing puzzle, which is that lighter green area, which is the Holden Proving Ground, which is now for sale. And I'll come to that in a second. So we've been working extensively with local groups. The big challenge here is in part urban development, but essentially quarries and these sand mines, so sand quarries, if you like, or sand mining to create the big build. And you can see the relatively intact areas in the background, but the quarries encroaching right up close to the bushland. So we were engaged in a very torturous process called the Distinctive Areas Landscape process, which hasn't been released yet, but it did have at least one important outcome, which is that the area has been formally identified as the Western Port Woodlands in planning parlance, and we're hoping that the final report will release soon and highlight the ongoing need to protect these areas. So this one's a slightly different one. It's not a huge area, but it's highly significant. We'd be keen to see ultimately that it's formally protected, either a mix of public reserves or private protected areas, or covenanted areas at a minimum, but also having important protection through planning controls. The big missing piece of the puzzle is the Holden Proving Ground, which is a very famous site where they tested the Holdens going around in circles at up to 200 kilometres an hour. But it's the back part of that site has extremely high conservation values, has been fenced for a long time, and is in really good nick. So we've been pushing and or asking the government to support purchase of that area. They may be able to use the proving ground for something else, or there may be buyers that are interested in using the actual circle bit or something else, but the back part is critically important. So that's the one form of it. But probably the big campaign at the minute, at least over the next few months, will be the Great Forest National Park, and this has got a long history. There's a statement from David Attenborough from 2014 who supported the park. There was also lots of other profile supporters for the Great Forest National Park, and there's been a consistent community push for decades. So here's a map that the BPA worked on. There was an investigation undertaken in the 1980s and early 90s to look at the Yarra Ranges through the Land Conservation Council, or the LCC, but it was largely compromised by forestry interests and really only protected the existing closed water catchments with some additions, but relatively modest fairly narrowly focused. So the current reserve with advances on information and new understanding of the value of these areas. Of course, they've also been logged quite a bit in the meantime. That original proposal was too small because things like the Mount Nash Forest has been listed as critically endangered. We've had the Leadbeater's possum also listed under national environmental laws as critically endangered. We've got a whole suite of endangered species like powerful owls and sooty owls, yellow-bellied gliders and greater gliders. And perhaps its greatest asset is that it's a recreation and tourism opportunity close to what is increasingly growing as a large metropolis. And if we compare that to Sydney, when you think about Melbourne, there's really not that many large protected areas close to Melbourne, within 90 minutes drive. There's some, but is there enough to deal with one of the fastest growing cities in the nation? So here's a map of Leadbeater's possums, and you can see the dark green is the park, and you can see their extensive Leadbeater possum records there in state forests, which are worthy of protection. And here's the original design of what a Great Forest National Park would look like, that was produced by conservation groups probably over 10 years ago now, and really about linking the existing national park in grey with new areas of protection, areas that were previously logged. So that's the vision, but we also need to ensure that it's done in a pragmatic way. So there's a Arties campaign. There was lots of work done around the 2014 election. An ALP commitment to a forestry industry task force. There's been a process since 2019 talking about proposed what they call immediate protected areas, but nothing really happened until this year. And so now things are starting to move, and hopefully there's a report in July, which will commence the process. So there was an interim report in December. There's been a whole lot of consultation. We've got a new Leadbeater's possum recovery plan, which recommends that there needs to be further protection for Leadbeater's possum. And then we've got a great outdoors task force, which is the government process to look at the whole east of the state. How they all fit together can be a bit confusing, and I think lots of people are confused about it. But the sort of key point, I suppose, is the opportunities now. There's a bit of media coverage about it. So always there's a bit of pushback and a debate about what you can and can't do in parks. Here's us responding in the Herald Sun to people who fear that four-wheel driving campers and so on will be locked out. Various conservations also talking about that. A lot of that is misinformation. Parks do restrict some activities, but many things like four-wheel driving, registered vehicles being used on declared roads are the same rules in national parks as they are in state forests. Hunting can be restricted, but can be planned for. Many of the other activities can also be planned for through a national park management plan. Dogs are a bit of a problem, but often you need a sensible planning process to ensure that there's appropriate regional plans, particularly near towns and so on, to ensure that people can take their dog to the water. So the next step for Great Forest National Park, we're doing some more work on reserve design, ramping up the public campaign. There's an escalation going on around calls for a new park. There's engagement with traditional owners, and everybody's support for this is important at this really critical time. Oh, here's a picture of Caitlin contemplating the future of the Wombat-Lerderderg National Park. But really, I won't go into the rest of it because we're almost at time. But the key point is hopefully that's given you insight into some of the priorities and future directions. But all of that work can be done with your support. And it's with your support that we can do our work, and we can't protect nature without that. So thank you all very much. Back to you, Caleb.
Thanks, Matt. All right. So thank you so much, Matt, for all of that incredibly meaty presentation. There's certainly a lot in there and a lot for all of us to digest, everything from the global context to the very localised context of what's happening in our state. And, you know, for all of you guys out there and the community who love nature, I'm sure you're excited about these opportunities for nature protection as well. Yeah, that was a picture of me in the Wombat Forest, a place that's special to me, but I'm sure there's also places that are really special to all of you out there. We do have time for some questions now. I'll put a first question to you, Matt. So the first one being around VIAC. So this question is, why isn't VIAC doing the reviews of ex-state forest post cessation of logging and instead this new panel?
Good question. So the government's decided to do it that way. VIAC still has a role, but they're really only doing assessments and not a full investigation, which they've done in other places. It's essentially a political decision. The government has decided that they don't necessarily want an expert review. They prefer a stakeholder process. Our preference would be for VIAC to do proper full investigation. That's been a tried and true method of getting really good outcomes, but also testing recommendations, because it's a sort of a 2 or 3 stage process where there's a discussion paper, draft recommendations, and then a final report. Which then goes to Parliament. So it's these different panels need to be engaged with, but I suppose lots of people would have preferred the traditional VIAC process.
All right, thanks, Matt. So not quite straightforward,
No.
but yeah, we need to work with what it is. Okay, so another question is, could you comment on the fact that native forest logging did not in fact stop on January the 1st, with a comment there saying that Warburton Environment has just commenced court action against DECA for huge old trees?
Yeah, so this is what we call loophole logging. So tonight I wasn't talking so much about that, but in other forums we have. So they essentially or announced the end of native forest logging for commercial uses. Vic Forest has now been abolished as the commercial arm. The government has said that they're ending native forest logging in the west of the state as well. So that traditional sort of commercial logging has ended. But there's this practice of loophole logging, I suppose you'd call it. And so we've seen a rise in logging on private land, which wasn't covered in the government's announcement. So we've seen probably a dozen or so sites where there's some either works being undertaken or there's planning applications being put in. And then we're seeing these works that are done under the guise of fire management. So both VMPA and other local groups like Watch and now Warburton Environment have taken a court case around what essentially is logging, looks like logging, smells like logging, walks like a duck, talks like a duck, is a duck, where works that are done under the guise of fire management, either strategic fuel breaks, storm cleanups, some fire recovery works, the timber is used or sold, though Forest Fire Management seem to say they don't sell it, but then they do say they do sell it, so it's very confusing, and are using essentially big forest contractors to do that. So this is something we really need to get in front of as well. to ensure that there's proper oversight and a proper regulatory regime to ensure that any of those sorts of works are done in an appropriate way. Currently, forest fire management have virtually no oversight, unlike native forest logging. I hope that answered the question. So, story all of its own. Yeah.
Yep. Again, not straightforward. Certainly complex and definitely keeping us on our toes and keeping us incredibly busy. That particular issue. Thanks, Matt. So I've got another question here from Greta Cunningham. This is on traditional owner management. So to what extent are local Aboriginal needs, use, conservation practices, etc., taken into account in considering the creation and management of national and other parks? For example, is this legislated?
So there's half a dozen. I should have put the map up with the Indigenous managed national parks. So, for example, Red Gum Parks are co-managed or jointly managed with the Yorta Yorta. Parks in Central Vic also been handed over for joint management there. Budge Bim in Western Victoria. So though that has emerged as a model, so it's joint or co-management of parks. So it's essentially native title with the parks layer over the top, if you like. There's a couple of variations of it, which we could spend a couple of hours on going through as well. The park regulations, which dictate what you can and can't do in a park, allow for cultural use and cultural extraction, but not for widespread commercial extraction is sort of the short answer. So there's variations of that. Parks were the first area of land, I suppose, to have joint and co-management. These areas are already managed in that way. I think the problem comes where you have larger scale extraction. There can be sort of barriers to that under a national park model. But certainly the co-management, joint management opportunities, potentially even sole management down the track, depending on how it's taken into account, is something that will emerge in the future, I suspect.
Great. All right. Thanks, Matt. I think that answers that question really well. We've got another question here from Tony Stephen, which is, how does the Victorian percentage of land in national parks compare to other states, especially New South Wales?
I can't remember New South Wales off the top of my head, sorry. I think Victoria's a bit above New South Wales, New South Wales being a much bigger state, of course. Probably the leader in the state, in the country, is Tasmania. With around 26% of the state in conservation areas. And so Victoria's about 18%. So it's about almost 50-50, if you like, or just under 50% of the public land is in some sort of park or conservation state. Currently, I just can't remember. Queensland is much lower. South Australia is quite significant. And New South Wales, I think, is somewhere in the middle. I just can't think of the figure off the top of my head.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Or you can just say Google it. It'll turn up.
Yeah. All right. So another question, anonymous question. So fully support the creation of new national parks, but where do we find the funds to manage new areas when Parks Victoria doesn't have enough funding to manage the current estate? Funding and staff seem to get cut back every year.
Yeah, so it's a really important point. And so parks do get cut. The question is, does anything get spent on state forests? So this is a sort of circular argument. So parks don't get enough money, that's clear. Less than 0.5% of the state's budget goes on managing 18% of the state. And some of that, that's also managing piers and jetties in Port Phillip Bay and Western Port, metropolitan parks like Albert Park and some of the other parks in the metropolitan area. They also get half their funding essentially from a levy on water bills. in parts of the metropolitan area. So the government puts in very little money. So 0.5% of the state's budget goes to managing parks. If you compare that to health or police is probably 14% or something, and education's probably 20-something%, and health's probably 20-something% as well. So we have been arguing for 1% of state budget to be put aside to manage parks, and more if there's more parks. That allows for it to be sort of CPI ready, if you like. So the more money the state generates, the amount of money that goes to park is links. So yeah, it's a challenge currently. Parks did get quite a lot of money during COVID and so on, but mostly for infrastructure. The issue, I think, the other issue is that there's a bit of a over focus on infrastructure, new campgrounds and picnic areas, and which are all important, but they seem to get easier levels of capacity to access funds as opposed to the sort of core ecological management, which lots of these areas really need. It's also going to be kept in context that there is money spent on state forests, but I don't know if it's any. I've never seen a published figure that says it's any more than what's spent on national forests. So if you change the tenure, you hope that the money that they already spend is also used for park management.
All right, thanks, Matt. So also, Tony, on your question around the states and where we sit in relation to the other states, we can get back to you on a more full answer to that question. We'll just do a couple more quick questions and then we'll start to wrap up from there. We've got a question from George Paris. Is this the longest record time ever of any state government in delaying to implement VAC or LC's, Victorian Environment Assessment Council or Land Conservation Council, clear recommendations?
Yes.
Great.
Is the short answer. And I think there was another question there from George about Ingrid. Like, one of the things that's happened is we've had 3 environment ministers in the last 12 months. So Lily Ambrosio was there for quite a while, and then Ingrid Stick took over for a short period around the time of the announcement of end of native forest logging, and the new environment minister is Steve Denopoulos. He's been there 6-ish months, so that never helps either, having a change in or a quick turnover of roles in that portfolio. But keeping in mind the Andrews Allen government have been in for a long time. It is very slow.
Thanks, Matt. So that was another question on Ingrid Stitt's role at this point in time. Yeah. So we'll just. So
she was Environment Minister for sure.
Yes. Yep. So I think we'll just do one more question for now. And there's some other questions in there that we can also get back to over the next couple of days from people. And this is a question on AWIN, which is a nice place to finish for our questions. So can you explain the reasons for the stopping of the Warburton bike trail? I'm glad it was stopped, is the question.
Yes, so there's 2 ways to look at it. So the Warburton Destination Mountain Bike Trail still exists as a proposal, and there is a continued funding, I think, for stage 1, which is in the state forest. The proposal for stage 2, which was in the Yarra Ranges National Park, was rejected through the Environmental Effects Statement process, so the EES. So that's a joint state and federal planning process that assessed the proposal, and it was found to have significant impacts on very high conservation values. So that was things like the Mount Donabuang ringless stonefly, which exists in no other place. There was also some key patches of cool temperate rainforest and a whole range of other issues that a high intensity mountain bike track were not compatible with. So the expert EES planning process and then finally the planning minister rejected it, and so it's off the. There's no proposal to pursue it in the national park part, but it's still going ahead, as I understand it, in the adjacent state forest. But if you
Great.
want to look on our website, there's a whole thing on what was said through the ES process that answers all those questions.
Great, thanks, Matt. And that was, that was a pretty important win that we had there. I think we'll leave our questions there for tonight. We've had some great questions, and from you, or from all of you. And there's some other questions that we haven't got around to answering this evening, but we'll look to follow up on those questions over the next couple of days for those who've put those questions forwards. And so I did want to take this opportunity to say thank you once again for joining us. The VMPA is actually the only organisation playing a leading role in all of these urgent campaign areas, and we can really only do this with the support of generous people like you who are part of this community who love and care for nature. So you can donate via the VMPA website or on the phone. And we're going to be sending a recording of this presentation next week, so you can have a look back if you wish. And in the meantime, we really do hope that you get some time to enjoy nature over this next week or month, whatever it might be. Some time for you to get into, enjoy and love nature, as well as the time to care for, stand up for and protect nature as well. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.